There are easier ways to enter the world than being declared a god before your first diaper change. Most babies get a midwife, a warm towel, and the quiet reassurance that it's fine to scream. A royal newborn in ancient Egypt, however, got priests, incense, and the immediate pressure of cosmic responsibility. Before the poor creature could even focus its eyes, someone was already proclaiming that it was Horus incarnate, a divine falcon disguised as an infant, here to keep the universe from falling apart. No pressure at all. Birth, in this world, wasn't a private affair. It was national theater. The palace smelled of myrrh, panic, and politics. Every cough of the queen was monitored like a weather omen. If she sneezed, it might be read as a prophecy about the Nile's flooding season. The royal astrologers spent the labor scanning the night sky for divine approval. A conveniently placed star could secure the dynasty's legitimacy. A cloud might require the urgent sacrifice of a cow. Somewhere, a scribe was already preparing a proclamation about how the gods smiled upon the horizon the moment the baby arrived, whether they did or not. The baby itself was swaddled in linen, finer than anything an ordinary mortal would ever touch. Linen was sacred. It symbolized purity, eternity, and, incidentally, the inability to breathe freely. Priests with shaved heads hovered like bureaucrats from the afterlife, inspecting every limb for divine perfection. A crooked toe could trigger theological debate. If the infant so much as burped, it might be declared an omen of prosperity or a warning, depending on who wanted a promotion that week. And then there were the omens. Ancient Egypt adored omens. Sacred geese honked cows' mood, and everyone tried to interpret whether that sound meant glorious rain or plague incoming. The gods, apparently, spoke fluent livestock. If a comet streaked across the sky, it meant heaven itself acknowledged the child's birth. If it didn't, someone might quietly invent one later on the temple walls. History, after all, was written by people with chisels and deadlines. From that first night, the infant was not seen as human. It was a vessel, a cosmic warranty that the sun would rise tomorrow. The palace trembled with the understanding that this small, wrinkled being was simultaneously the political future of Egypt and the spiritual reboot of the universe. Priests intoned hymns in voices so ancient they probably predated vowels, while servants bowed low enough to develop lifelong spinal issues. The air was thick with incense and expectation, two things that made everyone dizzy but nobody dared admit it. Somewhere, a court artist was already carving the royal name into stone, ensuring that even if the baby didn't survive the month, and many didn't, the divine narrative would. After all, a dead god was still good for morale. Birth announcements were less about the child, and more about the dynasty's cosmic credibility. Rejoice, Egypt, for the gods have blessed us again. The subtext was clear: please keep paying taxes. The newborn's first lullaby wasn't sung by a mother, but by a choir of priests, their voices trembling under the weight of eternity. No soft cooing, no gentle rocking, just hymns about solar boats and divine lineage echoing through cold limestone halls. It was less bedtime and more a theological recital, and as the infant drifted in and out of whatever passed for royal sleep, the entire kingdom took a breath of relief. The cosmic order was safe. For now, the sun would rise, the priests would eat, and a tiny god, still unable to hold its head upright, had already inherited the burden of maintaining the universe. Childhood, for a divine monarch, was mostly an exercise in looking sacred without drooling, while other toddlers learned how to stack blocks or chase beetles. A royal child's daily challenge was to remain upright under the crushing expectation of being semi-mental. Every breath had to look ceremonial. Even naps were supervised, lest the god-king in training roll over and ruin the symmetry of divinity. The palace nursery wasn't the sort of place one would describe as cozy. It was a miniature temple, cold floors, high ceilings, and an aroma that combined milk, incense, and mild anxiety. Instead of toys, the young heir received symbolic implements, tiny scepters, miniature crooks and flails, the occasional gold amulet shaped like a scarab. Anything fun enough to chew was confiscated on theological grounds. The idea was simple: gods didn't play, they performed. Even drooling had to look purposeful. The caregivers, usually a rotating ensemble of nurses, priests, astrologers, and political spies disguised as nannies, all took their roles with terrifying seriousness. Their job wasn't to raise a child, it was to prevent Egypt from collapsing due to a toddler's bad mood. One slip, One unblessed sneeze, and somewhere an entire agricultural district might erupt in fear of divine displeasure. A sneeze was never just a sneeze. It was potential evidence of cosmic imbalance. There was no childhood, only training for afterlife-adjacent management. The boy bee, 'cause of course it was always a boy, was bottle-fed on expectation. His milk was served from ceremonial vessels, each blessed by a priest and recorded in a scroll. If a servant dropped one, it was less oops and more prepare your will. Playtime, when permitted, involved supervised walks through courtyards designed to look humble while being lined with gold leaf, inscriptions reminding him that the fate of the cosmos rested on his tiny shoulders. Royal laughter was a dangerous sound. Too much joy, and priests would warn of excessive pride. Too little, and they'd mutter about divine melancholy. The safest expression was a faint, approving smile, the sort found on statues that haven't blinked in 3,000 years. Even infancy demanded political restraint. No tantrums, no sticky fingers, no mud pies, only perfect decorum and, if possible, gentle radiance. The closest thing to affection came from servants who weren't supposed to speak unless spoken to. Their whispers of comfort were technically heresy, but tolerated because the divine toddler often screamed louder than temple bells. Still, even tenderness was rationed. Being mortal was something to grow out of quickly. By the time the royal child could form words, he was already speaking like an institution. He didn't say, "I want." He said, "It pleases Horus." He didn't cry. He announced divine discomfort. Imagine being 3 years old and having to deliver every emotion through public relations. Every milestone, first steps, first words, first time not dropping a sacred rattle was a national event. The astrologers charted his progress in the stars. The priests recited hymns, and scribes documented each burp like it was a policy decree. The child's humanity wasn't erased. It was repackaged as a symbol of eternal order. He wasn't learning to live, he was being formatted for worship. By the end of his first decade, the divine toddler had become less a person and more a delicate political ecosystem. His shadow, his laughter, even his naps were managed by committees. And though he didn't yet know it, the stage was already being set for something far more exhausting than childhood: education. By the time most children were figuring out which end of a reed stylus not to chew on, the royal heir was already expected to master the language of the gods' teeny birds, eyes, and coiled snakes carved into stone with such obsessive precision that one misplaced line could turn a hymn into a death sentence. Education, for a pharaoh to be, wasn't about curiosity. It was about control. Knowledge was divine maintenance, and ignorance was a national emergency. The lessons began before sunrise, when the priest's chanting still echoed through the palace corridors like divine tinnitus. The young prince's day started not with porridge but with purification, a quick splash of cold holy water, and a recitation of his own greatness, which, to be fair, must have done wonders for self-esteem. His tutors arrived armed with scrolls, wax tablets, and a palpable sense of doom. There were no good mornings, just "may your wisdom equal that of Thoth," which is Egyptian for "don't embarrass us today." Hieroglyphs came first. Each sign had to be memorized, its sound, meaning, and divine implication. Mistake a duck for a vulture, and you might accidentally curse your grandmother. The boy learned quickly that words weren't neutral, they carried metaphysical weight. Writing was sacred engineering. A miswritten decree could offend a god, ignite a famine, or worse, invite a committee meeting of priests. Few punishments were harsher. Then came religion, a subject with roughly as many correct answers as there were stars in the sky. The prince memorized the names and genealogies of hundreds of deities, with specific moods, symbols, and dietary preferences. He was drilled on how many times to bow, which hymns to recite, and precisely how to present an offering without looking like he was bribing the divine. The priests corrected every blink, every pause, as if an improperly timed inhale might collapse the universe. One priest's frown could ruin a week. Mathematics followed, though not the sort useful for counting goats. Egyptian math was geometry, architecture, celestial mapping, practical skills for someone expected to one day build a structure visible from space. The young heir learned to calculate angles, volume, and the weight of stone blocks he would never personally lift. Failure wasn't an option. An imperfect pyramid wasn't just an isorit, was heresy in limestone. Public speaking lessons were next, because nothing says childhood fun like addressing thousands of subjects who believe your voice can make crops grow. The boy practiced delivering lines written for him by scribes who spoke in riddles and divine metaphors. Every phrase had to balance authority with serenity. Sound to firm, and you'd seem cruel; to gentle, and you'd look weak. There was no room for winging it. Improvisation was a mortal vice. Military instruction rounded out the day. Picture a child barely taller than a shield, learning how to smite enemies with grace and posture. His teachers demonstrated formations with miniature chariots, while the boy nodded solemnly, pretending to understand strategy when he could barely tie his sandals. Warfare, they explained, was not about bloodlust but cosmic balance. Each victory reaffirmed divine order. Each defeat hinted the gods had switched allegiances. By sunset, the divine pupil was exhausted, his head packed with symbols, rituals, and equations no human being could digest without divine intervention. But there were no evenings off. Before bed, he had to recite prayers for the stability of the cosmos, a polite reminder that if the sun failed to rise, it might technically be his fault. And as the stars emerged above the palace, those same priests who had tutored him by day would quietly debate which cousin might make a better backup god. It's difficult to form genuine friendships when every playdate doubles as a background check. For the young heir of Egypt, companionship was less about affection and more about risk management. The palace courtyards might have echoed with laughter, but beneath every giggle lurked political calculation. Every child within arm's reach had a title, a bloodline, and at least one parent plotting their strategic usefulness. Friendship, in this context, was simply espionage in miniature. The boys he was allowed to play with came from the upper crust of priestly or military families, future high officials, potential traitors, or both. The palace staff ensured that the heir never interacted too long with anyone of comparable ambition. Too much familiarity could lead to alliances, and alliances, in the royal imagination, led directly to assassinations. Even a friendly race through the gardens required supervision by at least 3 guards and 1 astrologer. If the prince tripped, someone took notes about possible divine instability. The atmosphere was one of exquisite paranoia. Tutors reported every conversation under the pretext of moral guidance. Servants whispered through linen curtains about who smiled too eagerly, who lingered too long near the royal sandals. Every look, every word, every shared joke could be interpreted as early signs of conspiracy. A dropped toy might be recorded as an omen of disloyalty. The young pharaoh in training learned early that trust was a dangerous hobby. Still, loneliness wasn't allowed either. A divine being couldn't appear solitary. It made the gods seem unpopular. So the palace ensured the prince was surrounded by a carefully curated entourage, children of nobles, the offspring of generals, the occasional cousin deemed politically harmless. Together, they enacted the theater of friendship, sharing meals, board games, and compliments so polite they could induce toothache. They played at camaraderie under the constant gaze of attendants who took notes for history. Real laughter, the sort that forgets itself, was risky. If the heir laughed too freely with the son of a priest, rumors might spread that he favored the temples over the army. If he frowned at a general's child, it might hint at future policy. Emotional neutrality became the safest posture. He mastered the art of the polite chuckle, the diplomatic nod, the gaze that suggested benevolence without attachment. Every child dreams of being a king. Few realize it means performing adulthood before your milk teeth are gone. Even letters' small exchanges of childish affection or gratitude were censored by scribes. The heir's handwriting lessons doubled as surveillance opportunities. If he mentioned liking someone's company, it could be politically weaponized. His personal diary was never personal. It was archived. His silences were safer than his words. The result was a kind of cultivated isolation, polite and perfumed. The young god learned to read people the way priests read omens, looking for hidden meanings, possible betrayals, favorable alignments. By adolescence, he could detect a lie faster than most adults could detect lunch. He became fluent in the language of half-truths and ceremonial compliments. But even the divine craved companionship. So, in quiet hours, he found solace in less treacherous company. Cats, symbols of grace and aloofness, who neither plotted nor cared for lineage. They purred, unaware of royal politics, and for a brief moment, the child could almost forget that his future friends would one day become his rivals. And as the cats coiled around his sandals, the tutors approached again, scrolls in hand, ready to remind him that divinity, unfortunately, comes with homework. By adolescence, the royal boy had ceased to be human in the eyes of everyone around him. He was now a polished emblem of eternity, a breathing monument required to sparkle on command. It's one thing to be told you're special. It's another to be told you personally guarantee the sunrise. The line between religion and stagecraft had dissolved entirely. His daily existence was a choreography of gestures, blessings, and the subtle panic of never, ever appearing mortal. Every step he took was documented, blessed, and occasionally analyzed by priests for divine symbolism. If he tripped, a committee would convene to interpret whether Horus was displeased or simply testing the nation's sense of humor. His meals were sanctified to ensure the gods approved of the menu. Imagine the logistics of asking the cosmos for permission to eat lentils, and when he sneezed, well, half the priesthood dropped what they were doing to debate whether it was an omen of fertility or the apocalypse. The new phase of training was about embodiment. The prince no longer merely studied the gods, he was one, technically. The problem was that nobody offered a guidebook for being divine while also occasionally suffering from acne. The contradictions were constant. He was told he commanded the elements but still wasn't allowed to walk alone, near open windows. He was a living god, yet forbidden from sweating in public. There were moments when even breathing seemed sacrilegious, unless done rhythmically and with incense. Daily rituals intensified. Before dawn, he stood half awake while attendants poured sacred water over his head and muttered hymns that sounded suspiciously like complaints. He donned layers of linen and gold, the ancient equivalent of heavy formalwear at 5 a.m., and practiced smiling like a statue eternal, faintly bored. His body was not his own. It was a sacred prop in the ongoing production titled Civilization. He learned that mistakes were dangerous not because of punishment, but interpretation. Drop a goblet, and you hadn't been clumsy, you had disrupted cosmic order. A yawn during prayers could hint at divine fatigue. Even illness became a theological crisis. If the young god developed a fever, priests scrambled to realign temples, farmers withheld planting, and courtiers whispered about celestial imbalance. The boy could never simply be unwell. He had to be symbolically contagious. The irony of divinity was that it came with no privacy and even less power. Every word he uttered carried weight, but he couldn't use it freely. If he admitted doubt, the entire religion trembled. If he expressed fear, the kingdom questioned fate. His emotions were national events. And yet, within that suffocating reverence, he began to sense the absurdity of it, all the endless incense, the stiff postures, the way everyone bowed as though trying to solve a cosmic math problem with their spines. The grand illusion of being divine wasn't that he was worshipped, it was that he was trapped in the performance of perfection. A sneeze could summon panic, a smile could realign economies, and all the while, the boy who was a god stood quietly wondering how many of his predecessors had managed to live their entire lives pretending not to notice how ridiculous it all was. And just when he'd begun to adjust to the sheer absurdity of holiness, the priests introduced him to the next divine duty, marriage. There comes a moment in every young pharaoh's life when the priests knock on the door, clear their throats, and inform him very gently that it's time to marry his sister. There's no easy way to phrase that. It's the dynastic equivalent of being told your family tree is less a tree and more a tightly wound shrub. The logic, apparently, was divine. Gods married gods, and since you were one, the most sacred union was with someone who also shared your mother, your bloodline, and probably your childhood toys. The announcement wasn't romantic. It was administrative. The high priest read it from a scroll as though it were a tax decree. To preserve cosmic balance, the royal bloodline must remain pure. Pure, in this context, meant genetically courtiers smiled nervously, while pretending that this was all perfectly normal. And the adolescent god nodded, equally nervous, pretending he understood why being married to his sister was somehow less disturbing than being single. The palace, naturally, buzzed with debate. Matchmaking for divinities wasn't a matter of compatibility but theology. Priests and astrologers spent weeks comparing star charts, arguing over which relative's birth sign aligned most harmoniously with the Nile flood schedule. One unlucky official was tasked with determining which cousin was least related by a fraction of a generation. Love, meanwhile, was considered an irrelevant civilian distraction. The gods didn't court, they consolidated power. The wedding preparations resembled both a coronation and a hostage negotiation. The bride arrived, glittering in gold, her expression frozen in that timeless royal blend of serenity and mild panic. The priests chanted hymns about divine union, while the royal family studiously avoided eye contact with genetic reality. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of denial. Everyone clapped, incense filled the air, and nobody mentioned that the guest list was also the family reunion. Afterward came the next sacred duty: produce heirs, quickly. The kingdom required assurance that the cosmic order, by which they meant the dynasty, would continue. The teenage pharaoh barely knew how to shave, but already he was being congratulated on future fertility. There were fertility rituals, offerings to Hathor, symbolic feasts involving bread, beer, and polite hysteria. Every month that passed without a royal pregnancy sent ripples of speculation through the court. The priests offered increasingly creative rituals to encourage divine conception, which was ancient Egyptian for awkwardly intrusive. Privately, the young couple endured the weight of expectation with a mix of confusion and silent resignation. The pharaoh, still half boy and half celestial PR campaign, understood that this was less about desire than duty. He wasn't making love, he was manufacturing legitimacy. And while the palace chroniclers would later record their union as a radiant merging of divine forces, the truth was probably quieter: two nervous teenagers under too much gold, performing eternity for an audience that never left. By dawn, the priests declared the cosmos renewed, the courtiers toasted to the purity of the royal line, and the young god added a new layer to his divine costume: husband, heirmaker, an eternal symbol of fertility. But soon, there would be a heavier accessory waiting for him: an actual crown. And with it, the unbearable weight of looking perfect in metal under the desert sun. The coronation of a pharaoh was the ancient equivalent of being buried alive, except with better lighting and more gold. It was the moment when the child of flesh officially became a statue that breathed. Every detail was engineered to signal eternity, from the incense-choked heir to the 40-pound crown designed to remind you that holiness and back pain often arrive together. The ceremony began before sunrise, because nothing says divine authority like depriving yourself of sleep. The young king was bathed in sacred water that felt like melted snow, anointed with oils imported from places no one could quite point to on a map, and then dressed in so many layers of linen that he could barely bend his knees. Attendants tied golden amulets to his arms, wrists, chest, ankles, basically anywhere that still had circulation. Then came the regalia, the crook and flail, symbols of leadership that also doubled as very inconvenient fashion accessories. The crowning itself was theatrical suffering. 2 crowns, one white, one red, representing Upper and Lower Egypt, were stacked together to form the double crown engineering choice that sounded poetic until you realized it was essentially strapping 2 helmets and a metaphor to your skull. The priests placed it on his head with the solemn gravity of people who knew exactly how much it weighed. Behold, they intoned, the Lord of the 2 lands. Inside the king's mind, however, a quieter voice whispered, this thing is definitely cutting off blood flow. But divine discomfort was part of the point. Every ache was symbolic. The weight of the crown represented the burden of the cosmos. The tightness of the linen reflected the purity of order. The numb legs, presumably, signified patience. As the ceremony dragged on, an unbroken symphony of hymns, smoke, and perfectly synchronized bowing, the pharaoh stood motionless, smiling that fixed, tranquil smile every statue would later immortalize. To fidget was to risk destabilizing reality. His outfit alone could have funded a small province. The chest plate gleamed with lapis and turquoise, stones believed to channel heavenly energy, but better known for giving you heat rash. The leopard skin sash, worn for divine vigor, smelled faintly of yesterday's divine leopard. Even his sandals were made of woven papyrus and lined with symbolism instead of comfort. Somewhere in the back row, a scribe was already drafting a hymn about how radiant the new pharaoh looked, carefully omitting any mention of sweat. When the high priest finally proclaimed him the living Horus, the crowd erupted in rehearsed ecstasy. Trumpets blared, offerings burned, and the smell of frankincense mixed with human exhaustion. The king raised his ceremonial scepter, golden, heavy, absolutely useless, and waved to his people as if he wasn't seconds away from fainting. It was the first of many performances in a life defined by endurance, because that's what being crowned a god truly meant. Not freedom, not power, but perfect posture in unbearable heat. The divine image had to appear effortless, even if it was agony in slow motion. And from that day forward, the weight of the crown never really lifted, not even in sleep, not even in doubt. For now, the boy was gone. Only the god remained anointed, immobile, and already learning that perfection comes with a neck cramp. Soon, the real trials would begin. Being a living god wasn't about wearing gold. It was about surviving the blame for everything that went wrong under the sun he supposedly controlled. Once the applause faded and the incense thinned, the young pharaoh discovered the fine print of divinity. Everything was his fault. Too much rain. The gods were pleased, but perhaps a bit too enthusiastic. Clearly a management issue. Not enough rain. The gods were sulking. Pharaoh must have skipped a ritual. A bad harvest. An eclipse. A crocodile looking at someone funny. All of it somehow circled back to the man in the gold hat. Being a living god meant taking credit for the sun and the blame for everything else. The illusion of omnipotence was exhausting. Officially, Pharaoh maintained the divine balance of the universe. Unofficially, that meant every sunrise, tax shortage, and sandstorm was an item on his to-do list. He was the CEO of cosmic maintenance, armed with incense instead of insight. People believed his prayers kept the Nile flowing, that his dreams forecast the nation's fortune. So when he overslept, someone somewhere panicked that eternity might be late to work. There was no such thing as privacy. Every sneeze, sigh, and facial twitch was analyzed by priests like data points in a holy spreadsheet. If the king frowned, a new temple was commissioned. If he smiled, taxes increased. If he yawned during a ritual, divine fatigue. Clearly, the clergy loved this system. It kept them employed interpreting the royal sinuses. One court scribe famously noted that the pharaoh's hiccup foretold prosperity in the barley fields. One can only imagine the economic chaos a burp might have caused. Even his dreams were not his own. The moment he woke, the astrologers pounced, demanding to know if he'd seen any symbolic birds or suspicious pyramids in his sleep. A nightmare about drowning could trigger a national festival to appease Sobek, god of crocodiles. A dream about falling. Excellent time to expand the treasury's foundations. No one asked how he slept, only what the gods had whispered through his REM cycle. And when things truly went wrong, a drought, a plague, a small revolution in a provincial garrison, the kingdom didn't look for explanations. It looked at him. Farmers prayed louder, priests performed longer, and advisors quietly began updating their resumes. Because if divine favor was slipping, it meant Pharaoh had sinned, or worse, that the gods wanted a replacement model. Divine right was eternal, but divine approval was notoriously fickle. In response, the king doubled down on ritual. More offerings, more processions, more speeches about cosmic harmony, delivered with the enthusiasm of a man trying to convince both himself and the universe that everything was fine. It was a feedback loop of devotion and dread. The more he was blamed, the more he performed, and the more he performed, the more fragile his godhood became. The empire didn't run on faith, it ran on fear disguised as reverence. Still, he endured. That's what pharaohs did. Stand tall, smile like the sun incarnate, and absorb the chaos of creation with suspiciously perfect eyeliner. He couldn't flinch. Even doubt was political. So he blessed the crops, waved to the crowds, and privately wondered whether the gods ever found the whole arrangement as funny as he did. And while the priests debated the spiritual significance of his latest cough, dawn approached again, time for another day of ritual labor, disguised as worship. Being pharaoh meant never sleeping in. Dawn wasn't so much a beginning as it was a deadline. Before the first bird dared to sing, priests were already shuffling through the palace halls, carrying trays of incense and holy water, muttering prayers about renewal while silently hoping the divine didn't sneeze on them. The morning ritual wasn't optional. It was the cosmic equivalent of clocking in. Miss it, and the sun might refuse to rise out of pure passive aggression. The wake-up call came with ceremony. No gentle knocking, just a small choir of attendants, chanting hymns in tones that sounded suspiciously like panic. The royal bedchamber filled with the scent of burning myrrh, the air so thick with holiness you could choke on it. The first task was purification. Cold water from a sacred pool poured over skin that was not awake enough to appreciate spiritual clarity. There was no coffee, only enlightenment by hypothermia. Then came dressing, which was less about fashion and more about theology. Every piece of linen had to be folded in a specific order, pre-blessed by someone who hadn't smiled in 20 years. The pharaoh's robe was tied, untied, retied, inspected for symbolic wrinkles, and finally secured with an amulet shaped like a falcon, because nothing says authority like wearing a small bird against your chest. Each step took so long that by the time he was dressed, it was technically mid-morning in several neighboring kingdoms. Once properly packaged, he proceeded to the temple. There, a priest unrolled a scroll roughly the length of a crocodile and began reading instructions for what the divine should do today. Lift this bow, that, anoint that statue. Don't look too mortal while doing it. The rituals were endless choreography gestures, timed with chants, smoke rising in perfect synchronization with celestial expectations. Each movement affirmed cosmic balance, which was lovely in theory and absolutely excruciating in practice. A single sneeze could derail an entire ceremony. If the pharaoh stumbled over a verse or blessed the wrong statue, everyone froze. The air filled with the faint sound of existential dread. Someone would cough delicately, another would mutter a quick corrective prayer, and the procession would continue, pretending nothing had happened. Divine perfection, after all, had a reputation to maintain. The ceremonies could last hours. Kneeling, standing, gesturing, repeating the physical toll was monumental. His knees hurt, his back screamed, and the makeup holding his divinity together began to melt. But there was no sitting down in eternity. To show fatigue was to risk implying that the cosmos itself might also be tired, and nobody wanted to test that theory. By the time the rituals ended, the king had maintained the universe for at least 3 hours without breakfast. The crowd outside cheered. The priest sighed in relief. The gods, one hoped, were satisfied enough not to send locusts before lunch. But the day was just beginning. Beyond the incense and hymns waited the living labyrinth of the palace-whispering courtiers, nervous guards, and 1,000 smiling faces, each calculating exactly how long the divine might last. Power in ancient Egypt came with a curious side effect. You couldn't tell the difference between loyalty and good acting. The palace glittered with gold, but it reeked of fear. Everyone bowed too low, smiled too wide, and spoke in the careful tone of people constantly wondering whether this would be the day they were fed to a crocodile by divine. Will Pharaoh, god though he was, lived in a palace built on suspicion, and the walls had better ears than the gods themselves. The guards were loyal, of course, until someone offered them a larger pyramid or a prettier wife. The cupbearer, that most intimate of attendants, smiled warmly as he poured the wine, pausing just long enough to let the question hover. Was that pause devotion or dosage? Even the royal food tasted of anxiety. Every meal was pre-tasted by servants whose stomachs were considered a disposable line of defense against ambition. The kitchen staff prayed constantly, mostly that the spices masked the faint taste of poison. Advisors were worse. They came armed with scrolls and smiles, their words dripping with sincerity and subtle treason. One warned of enemies abroad, another warned of enemies within. A third, inevitably, warned about the first two. The pharaoh nodded through it all, already calculating which of them would be the first to start whispering in a rival's ear. It wasn't paranoia if history kept proving you right. Egypt's tombs were full of kings who had trusted the wrong smile. The royal family didn't help. Brothers, uncles, half-brothers each, convinced the gods would have chosen them if only the stars had been properly consulted. They lingered in the corridors like beautiful vultures, flattering by day and sharpening daggers by night. Queens, plural, maneuvered their sons into position with the precision of military campaigns. A family dinner could feel like a séance for all the ghosts it was bound to create. Assassinations were practically a genre. Mysterious illness was the official euphemism for someone finally got creative. Death by scorpion venom disguised as perfume. Death by date, wine politely offered during a feast. Death by decorative cobra that turned out to be a little too decorative. It was a courtly tradition to die suddenly and be declared called to the gods, while everyone else politely avoided eye contact and commissioned new statues. So the pharaoh adapted. He ate little, slept lightly, and changed his daily routine often enough to confuse even his most devoted spies. He dismissed servants without warning, replaced guards mid-watch, and never used the same bath twice in a week. It wasn't about comfort, it was about staying unpredictable in a palace where predictability was a death sentence. Even rest became ritualized defense. Nights were the worst. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the faint shuffling of guards or the sigh of a door hinge that shouldn't have sighed. The pharaoh kept a dagger beneath his pillow, a ceremonial one. Technically, though a sharp point is still a sharp point. Outside, his guards stood still as statues, practicing the same expression they'd wear if he didn't wake up. The irony was almost poetic. The man believed to control life and death couldn't close his eyes without fearing both. Every sunrise was proof he'd outlasted one more plot, one more whisper, one more ambitious cousin. And yet, as morning light crept over the temple walls, the performance began again, crowds waiting, priests chanting, enemies smiling. Because in Egypt, survival wasn't a miracle, it was a daily ritual. If the palace was a cage, the public stage was its theater. Every time the pharaoh stepped outside, Egypt erupted into a symphony of trumpets, incense, and orchestrated awe. The people didn't see a man, they saw the sun in sandals, and so he smiled, waved, and pretended not to notice that his ceremonial chariot was basically a portable oven with wheels. The royal makeup melted before noon, the linen clung like gilt, and the gods, those smug spectators, watched from above, surely amused by the sight of their chosen one, sweating through eternity. Public life was performance art at a cosmic scale. Processions wound through crowded streets, where peasants bowed so low it was hard to tell whether it was reverence or back pain. The pharaoh stood upright in a golden chariot, draped in jewelry so heavy it could have doubled as punishment. His posture had to convey serenity, his eyes distant wisdom, his expression an unwavering blend of majesty and mild constipation. Beneath the golden chants, though, was a single unspoken truth: he couldn't stop. Not moving, not smiling, not performing divinity, not for a second. The festivals were endless, designed to reaffirm the God King's eternal perfection through prolonged exposure to heatstroke. During harvest celebrations, he blessed wheat he'd never touched. During fertility rites, he nodded approvingly, while priests danced with vegetables. There were sacred dramas in which the pharaoh had to reenact the triumph of light over chaos, often in full regalia, waving props that weighed more than his moral support. Sometimes the actors playing the defeated demons were actual prisoners. Authenticity, after all, mattered. The people cheered, of course. They always did. They loved him the way one loves a thunderstorm, grateful when it nourished the earth, terrified when it lingered too long. They brought gifts, baskets of grain, carved figurines, the occasional goat that definitely wasn't house-trained. From the balconies of temples, nobles waved with rehearsed enthusiasm, pretending they weren't already speculating how long the divine might last before divine succession. To falter publicly was unthinkable. One slip, one stagger, one visible sign of exhaustion could send the priesthood into existential meltdown. If the pharaoh fainted from heat, the scribes rewrote it as entered divine trance. If he tripped on a step, it became the gods humbling him for wisdom. Perfection wasn't optional, it was the entire economy. Even the pigeons knew better than to relieve themselves near the royal canopy. At night, when the processions ended, he returned to the palace, a wax figure melting at the edges. Servants peeled off layers of linen like shedding the skin of holiness, revealing a human underneath, exhausted, sore, and possibly sunburned in the shape of a falcon. He collapsed onto a bed still reeking of incense, knowing tomorrow would bring another festival, another crowd, another chance to pretend that being adored didn't hurt. The irony was that even the gods had more privacy. The statues could at least rest between offerings. But the pharaoh, his job was to stay visible, eternal, untouchable, until the moment he wasn't. And when the crowds dispersed and the torches dimmed, a quieter truth flickered beneath the gilded perfection. The divine might rule Egypt, but the priests ruled the divine. Behind every god, there's a committee. In Egypt, that committee wore linen, smelled of frankincense, and called itself the priesthood. Officially, they served the pharaoh, the living embodiment of Horus, lord of the two lands. Unofficially, they managed him with the same patience, one reserved for an overpromoted intern who might accidentally destroy the cosmos if unsupervised. Temples weren't just places of worship, they were the ancient world's best-run corporations. They owned land, traded grain, issued loans, and even kept their own archives. The gods might have lived in heaven, but their accountants most certainly did not. The temples held Egypt's real wealth: gold, livestock, linen, incense, property, all funneled into the sanctuaries of Ammon, Ra, or whichever deity had the best marketing that century. The pharaoh might have worn the crown, but the priests controlled the ledgers. They could fund or starve entire provinces simply by adjusting how often a god smiled upon the harvest. And since every ritual, every blessing, every decision had to be approved through the divine channels of the temple, the king's power passed through a network of men in robes who answered to eternity, not to him. The high priests of Karnak were the worst offenders. They spoke with the slow assurance of people who knew that even the pharaoh's divinity depended on their endorsement. If a priest announced that the gods had withdrawn favor, the nation trembled. Pharaoh could order a war. The priests could declare one cosmically inadvisable. Their tool wasn't the sword, but the whisper, soft, patient, devastating. A shadow passes over the sun, they might say, and suddenly half the court questioned whether the divine king had angered heaven. Subtle sabotage wrapped in sanctity. They also enjoyed exemptions that would make any modern tax auditor cry. Temple land was untouchable. Their workers were holy laborers, immune to conscription. The state treasury struggled, but the temple granaries overflowed. Priests dined on offerings meant for gods, traded surplus incense, and invested in papyrus ventures. They were spiritual CEOs with perfect PR. We serve only the gods, they said, while discreetly buying more real estate than Pharaoh himself. And yet, the relationship was codependent. The priests needed Pharaoh's image to legitimize their rituals, just as Pharaoh needed their rituals to legitimize his image. Without them, he was a man in a hat. Without him, they were bureaucrats in skirts. Together, they performed the eternal duet of power and holiness, each pretending the other was indispensable. The priests praised Pharaoh in public and corrected him in private, always deferential, always condescending. They'd bow so deeply their foreheads nearly touched the floor, then rise with eyes that said, "We'll be deciding your divinity's schedule for tomorrow." Every festival, every cosmic realignment, every solar procession was stage managed by these quiet manipulators. They decided which gods got attention, which temples expanded, and which oracles conveniently declared the pharaoh's latest policy, divinely inspired or not. If the king ever tried to reduce their influence, omens darkened, birds flew the wrong direction, and someone discovered a new prophecy, suggesting that maybe the gods preferred a different ruler altogether. It was an empire within the empire, perfumed and polite, yet unmovable. And the longer Pharaoh reigned, the more he realized the bitter truth. The gods might speak through him, but the temples edited the transcript. And while he tried to maneuver around their sanctified grip, another danger grew far closer to home, one that wore his own jewelry and called him family. The royal family of Egypt was less a family and more a beautifully dressed civil war. The palace looked serene from the outside, its pillars tall, its gardens symmetrical, but inside, the air shimmered with paranoia thick enough to pickle a priest. Every relative with a drop of royal blood believed destiny had just been slightly mistaken. Pharaoh wasn't surrounded by kin. He was surrounded by competitors, waiting for the gods to correct a clerical error. Succession in Egypt was never simple. There was no tidy rule of firstborn gets the job. No succession was a blood sport wrapped in incense. Whoever survived the most accidents gained the loudest priestly endorsement and managed to outlive the family scorpions, usually won. The result was generations of dynastic chaos disguised as divine will. Officially, the gods chose Egypt's rulers. Unofficially, Egypt's rulers chose whichever gods could be persuaded to look the other way. Brothers eyed brothers, like duelists, cousins, smiled with the serenity of people rehearsing each other's funerals. Half-uncles, half-sisters, and uncles twice removed by divine decree, all maneuvered for influence, each with their own cabal of advisors, generals, and temple officials. The palace corridors buzzed with gossip, some true, some invented on demand. A cough could start a rumor. A prolonged silence could start a coup. Pharaoh's table was the most dangerous place in Egypt, not because of poison, though there was that too, but because every toast meant something, and everyone knew it. The queens were power brokers in their own right. There was never just one. Egypt adored the idea of celestial abundance. Each royal wife came with her own faction, her own sons, her own theories about which boy the gods really preferred. The women of the harem ran diplomacy like a shadow cabinet, trading favors, alliances, and hairpins as weapons. One ill-timed smile at the wrong queen could ignite a war disguised as family dinner. And then there were the sons, groomed from birth like horses at auction. Each was taught that he might one day wear the crowns, so long as he didn't die trying. Tutors whispered ambition into their ears, disguised as destiny. Mothers whispered vengeance, disguised as bedtime stories. By the time they were teenagers, most royal heirs were already fluent in politics, astrology, and the art of surviving breakfast. Every death within the family was a national event, complete with public mourning and private relief. When an uncle fell mysteriously ill, the priests declared it the will of the gods, and the servants declared it obvious. When a general slipped on the palace stairs, everyone nodded solemnly, as if gravity itself had taken a bribe. Even Pharaoh's own survival began to feel improbable, as though his continued breathing depended less on divine favor and more on sheer administrative oversight. Tombs were built early, not just for the afterlife, but as emergency housing in case family diplomacy escalated. Pharaoh's paranoia wasn't madness, it was madness. Every relative increased the probability of betrayal. Every ceremony was another opportunity for poison, daggers, or strategically placed cobras. And yet, through all the bloodline melodrama, Egypt continued to function as though accustomed to ruling itself, while the royal family quietly thinned the herd. The irony, of course, was that the same relatives plotting Pharaoh's downfall would later build temples in his honor, proof that in Egypt, devotion and ambition were often the same thing. Eventually, even the god king couldn't keep his eyes on every smiling traitor. Age crept in, whispers multiplied, and he began preparing for the only event no one could sabotage: his own death. When a pharaoh finally died, Egypt didn't mourn so much as it mobilized. The divine expiration was less a tragedy and more an administrative marathon. The announcement always came wrapped in reverence. The sun has set upon the two lands, which was poetic shorthand for start the embalming before he starts leaking. The moment his pulse stilled, the priests swooped in like bureaucratic vultures, armed with ointments, linen, and spiritual euphemisms. Death, after all, was not an ending in Egypt. It was just the next great performance. The body, still technically sacred property, was whisked away to the house of purification, where a team of professionals prepared to turn the former god into a kind of eternal museum exhibit. The process began with organ removal, each extracted with ceremonial precision and placed in canopic jars guarded by animal-headed deities that looked suspiciously like over-enthusiastic mascots. The lungs, liver, stomach, intestines all labeled, blessed, and stored like divine leftovers. The heart, however, was left inside. You'd need it later, when you stood in judgment and hoped it didn't weigh more than a feather. The brain, out through the nose, not metaphorically literally hooked and pulled, piece by piece, through the nostrils. Egyptians were nothing if not practical. The brain was messy, and they didn't think much of it anyway. The seat of intelligence, they believed, is in the heart, which must have been comforting for everyone involved, because scraping grey matter through a straw is easier when you're convinced it's not important. Next came the drying 40 days buried in natron, a mineral salt that could suck the moisture out of a small lake. The once radiant guard shrank, shriveled, and slowly turned into something between jerky and relic. Priests returned daily to chant, flip, and sprinkle aromatic oils over the body, ensuring it smelled more like holiness and less like chemistry. By the end, the pharaoh resembled an extremely dedicated raisin, light, leathery, and full of spiritual significance. Then came the wrapping yards upon yards of linen, layer after layer, each inscribed with protective spells, each fold accompanied by murmured prayers. The process took weeks. One slip of the bandage, one forgotten charm, and eternity could get awkward. Jewelry was added between layers, amulets of scarabs, ankhs, and tiny gold eyes to ward off malevolent forces and ensure the royal afterlife came with accessories. When they finally finished, the pharaoh was less a corpse than a manifesto-preserved ideology with a human outline. Of course, the coffin was no simple box. It was coffins, plural, nested containers of wood, gold, and symbolism. Each one told a version of the same story. Here lies a god, please don't rob him. Which was ironic, because the builders of the tombs often doubled as their first burglars. Despite all the curses carved into the walls, most royal tombs were looted within decades. The priests would blame impiety, the guards would blame ghosts, and the thieves would blame everyone but themselves while wearing suspiciously ornate bracelets. But the tomb itself now, that was the true statement piece. A subterranean palace painted with guidebooks for eternity, stocked with treasures, furniture, food, and more amulets than a superstitious flea market. Scenes depicted the pharaoh conquering enemies, embracing gods, sailing through the underworld with enviable posture. The purpose was simple: to remind the cosmos who was coming. And yet, beneath all the splendor, there lingered an unspoken fear that eternity might forget. To die was one thing, to be erased was another. If your name was chiseled out, your soul vanished. And so, the priests inscribed it everywhere: walls, sarcophagus, amulets, even the soles of the royal sandals, because no god wanted to be nameless in paradise. Still, there was one last irony waiting in the dark. For all the effort poured into preservation, most pharaohs ended up in museum glass, their eternal rest disturbed by tourists eating sandwiches. The gods, it seemed, had a sense of humor. And yet, death wasn't the end of duty. There were still wars to lead, victories to stage, and legends to exaggerate. For even the dead had reputations to defend. For someone who spent so much time surrounded by linen, incense, and divine paperwork, the pharaoh was expected to be surprisingly good at stabbing. Egypt's kings weren't just rulers, they were walking billboards for military glory. A pharaoh without a victory was like a pyramid without a point, structurally possible, but profoundly embarrassing. War, therefore, was less about conquest and more about marketing bloodshed as public relations, with chariots and eyeliner. The scripts were always the same. The gods whispered of foreign insolence, the high priests interpreted the whisper as an urgent need for expansion, and the royal scribes, blessed their quills, immediately began drafting victory hymns before the battle even started. His Majesty smote the enemies of Egypt, they'd write, confident that reality would adjust itself later. After all, when you're divine, you don't lose, you merely redefine victory. The actual logistics of warfare were less poetic. Pharaoh was expected to lead from the front, symbolically of course, though occasionally in person if the priests demanded a convincing performance. Imagine a man who spent his life blessing statues now forced into a chariot, brandishing a bronze sword heavier than his sense of destiny. The royal armor glittered impressively, especially under arrows. His soldiers adored him but probably preferred when he stayed at a distance. Protecting a god on wheels wasn't anyone's idea of an easy campaign. Battles themselves were brutal but brief. Dust, blood, chaos, and the eternal problem of trying to look heroic while swatting flies. The pharaoh's charioteer, a deeply underpaid man, had the unenviable job of steering divinity through spear fire while keeping the royal wig intact. When Egypt triumphed, and they always did, according to official records, the field would be littered with corpses, and the scribes would carefully count severed hands to prove the body count. Nothing says civilization like statistical mutilation. Returning home, the propaganda machine roared to life. Artists carved scenes of pharaohs smiting enemies twice his size, their faces conveniently foreign and their torsos artistically groveling. The actual battles might have been modest skirmishes, but on temple walls they became cosmic wars between light and chaos. Even defeat could be retouched. Though the enemy was crafty, His Majesty triumphed through divine patience, which roughly translated to "we ran," but with dignity. These victories weren't just military, they were theological. Each triumph reaffirmed the balance of the universe. Each conquered tribe was proof that the gods had chosen correctly when they blessed Egypt with its overworked monarch. And if the campaign failed, the priests would quietly suggest the gods had demanded a test of faith, followed by an increase in temple donations. Conveniently circular, eternally profitable. The cost of such glory was staggering. War drained treasuries, exhausted soldiers, and occasionally produced more widows than statues. But peace was worse. Peace gave courtiers time to plot. So Pharaoh waged war to stay divine, and divine to stay alive. It was a delicate balance, like juggling flaming cobras, while pretending it was all part of the ceremony. And when the dust finally settled, and the songs were written, the Pharaoh's legacy gleamed brighter than ever. Or so it seemed until the next ruler decided to revise history. Because nothing in Egypt, not even eternity, was safe from editing. Long before the cigarette turned smoke into a habit, people treated it like a prayer. Fire wasn't just for warmth, and smoke wasn't just a side effect. It was a message, one of the few that could rise and vanish at the same time. Across ancient landscapes, humans watched that pale ribbon curl toward the sky and decided it was trying to go home. Breath became wind, wind became spirit, and the act of burning something fragrant turned into a method of communication. No one knew who first looked at a column of smoke and thought, yes, that's how we'll talk to the gods, but humanity never really stopped trying. The oldest evidence of ritual smoke comes from campfires, where herbs were thrown not for taste but for presence. Archaeologists still find traces of charred plants in ceremonial site: sage, cedar, juniper, tobacco, scattered like lost punctuation marks in an ancient conversation. To burn a plant was to release its essence, its breath. What the lungs couldn't say, the smoke might carry. The air itself became a messenger, slipping between visible and invisible worlds. People didn't see the act as destruction. They saw it as translation. Every culture, it seems, discovered its own grammar of smoke. In Siberia, shamans burned resin to lure their spirits home. In the high Andes, offerings of coca and llama fat curled upward in white spirals that mimicked mountain mist. In North America, pipes and bundles of herbs turned every exhale into theology. It wasn't about intoxication. It was about participation, joining the endless cycle of breath that everything in creation shared. Smoke was the physical proof that prayers had weight before they disappeared. Fire, of course, was the other half of the conversation. In every ritual, someone tended it like a guest. Flames demanded etiquette, never lit casually, never left unattended. Fire was fed, coaxed, and thanked, as though it might take offense if ignored. The smoke it released was treated as a living thing, not a byproduct. Some traditions said the smoke didn't just listened. It wove between human voices and celestial ones, decoding grief, gratitude, or requests for good weather. Anthropologists later called this symbolic communication, as if smoke were an early postal service for the supernatural. The practitioners, meanwhile, already knew that breath and prayer came from the same place in the body. What's remarkable is how universal the impulse was. Even cultures separated by oceans seemed to agree that communication with the unseen required combustion. In Egypt, frankincense rose from temple altars. In China, incense curled through ancestor halls. In the Amazon, burning herbs called forest spirits to feast. The pattern was uncanny. To reach what can't be touched, you had to change matter into air. Maybe humanity understood, long before science confirmed it, that transformation was the language of the universe. And yet, not all smoke was equal. Some herbs soothed, others provoked. Some called spirits closer, others chased them away. Choosing the wrong one could mean the difference between inviting an ancestor and irritating something older. The art of smoke was precise. Certain plants were burned only at dawn, others only in morning. Tobacco, for instance, carried the gravity of truth. Sage, the gentleness of cleansing. Sweetgrass, the warmth of welcome. Each had its own tone, like instruments in a cosmic orchestra. To light them was to tune the air itself. In the end, the world beneath the smoke and the one above it weren't separate, they were reflections of the same breath. Every ritual reminded the living that they were porous, temporary, half-air already. The smoke simply made the invisible visible for a moment, before fading back into the mystery that birthed it. And somewhere in those ancient clouds of grey and gold, one particular leaf began to dominate the conversation, a plant that carried both promise and warning, whose breath could sanctify or destroy depending on who held the flame. Tobacco, before it became a habit, was a vow. The first peoples to burn or smoke, it didn't do so for comfort, they did it for truth. Among dozens of indigenous nations across North America, tobacco was the plant that sealed words. To offer it was to bind yourself to what you said. It made every promise combustible. Once spoken, once smoked, it drifted upward, irretrievable. You couldn't take your word back any more than you could reassemble the ashes. To the Ojibwe, the Lakota, the Cherokee, the Blackfoot, tobacco was a sacred breath, a way to balance the seen and the unseen. It didn't relax anyone, it clarified. Prayers rolled out with the smoke, because air was spirit, and breath was the only possession that could be freely shared with the gods. The pipe wasn't a personal object. It was a bridge between tribes, between worlds, between the person who spoke and the forces that listened. Every draw was a translation of intention into wind. Ceremonies involving tobacco were never casual. The blend was chosen carefully, sometimes mixed with red willow bark or sweetgrass. Each variation fine-tuned to the purpose: peace, grief, gratitude, reconciliation. When the pipe passed in council, it carried the weight of every generation before it. You didn't light it for amusement. You lit it to make creation pay attention. Even the direction of the smoke mattered, offered to the four winds, to the ancestors, to the sky. Every exhale had geography. The tobacco itself was grown ritually, tended with songs rather than fertilizer. Farmers spoke to the plants as if they were listening, which, in their cosmology, the first leaves were offered back to the earth before harvest began. An ancient version of reciprocity. To take something sacred without giving thanks would risk cosmic imbalance. The harvest wasn't industry, it was negotiation. When Europeans arrived, they saw smoke and called it superstition, then stole the habit and removed the prayer. Tobacco crossed the ocean and lost its holiness in transit. In Europe, the pipe became novelty. The breath of the gods became a business plan. What was once ritual became repetition, every puff emptying meaning faster than lungs. Addiction was the secular echo of devotion, the same need to inhale something powerful, minus the reverence. Even so, the old stories didn't vanish. In indigenous cosmologies, tobacco still mediates truth. Elders burn it before difficult conversations, before asking for guidance or forgiveness. It's a way of saying, I'm listening to the universe, please listen back. Modern science likes to focus on nicotine and neurons, but the elders still call it our first medicine, a plant that reminds the body how to speak to spirit, and in a way that's not metaphorical. Smoke, after all, is what breath looks like when it remembers it's infinite. But tobacco wasn't the only plant to carry a message skyward. Where tobacco spoke to gods, another plant listened to ghosts, soft, grey, and fragrant enough to clear the air of anything too heavy for the living. The pipe wasn't an accessory. It was a geography lesson in disguise. Every part of its stone bowl, wooden stem, the smoke rising between them mapped the relationship between the earth and the sky. When it was lifted and joined, that was creation itself reenacted in miniature. The earth opening its mouth, the heavens lending their breath. To smoke from it was to briefly hold the universe between your hands and hope you didn't drop it. Among the Lakota, Dakota, and many neighboring nations, the pipe chinonpo wasn't owned, it was carried. Its bearer didn't keep it for personal comfort, but for the people. Carving one was a ritual of precision and patience, usually from red catlinite, a stone found in sacred quarries where even enemies paused their wars. To break the peace, there was to risk spiritual exile. The quarry was neutral ground. The way the pipe itself was a neutral object, its purpose was to hold breath, not ego. When a pipe was lit, time slowed down. No one rushed through smoke, that was technically a prayer. The first draw went to the sky, the second to the earth, the third to the four directions. The rest shared among those present, who passed it clockwise, as if tracing the sun's path. The smoke didn't just rise, it circled, forming an invisible dome of intention over everyone gathered. Each puff was a signature, each exhale an agreement. When the last ember died, the covenant was sealed. What the pipe meant depended on the moment. In council, it was the notary public of diplomacy. You smoked to prove sincerity, not superiority. Between families, it marked alliances or forgiveness. Between human and spirit, it was a confession, a call, or sometimes a dare. Those who held the pipe wrong literally or morally invited consequences. You couldn't lie in its presence. The spirits were assumed to be listening with better hearing than humans. European chroniclers were confused. They wrote about the peace pipe as if its only purpose was to calm political tension, but they missed the point. Peace was incidental. The pipe wasn't about negotiation. It was about renewal, rebalancing the breath of the world after too many loud days. To misuse it was worse than disrespectful. It was cosmological vandalism, and so pipes were cleaned, blessed, and stored like living beings, wrapped in cloth, fed with tobacco, sung to in the dark. Inside the lodge, where smoke thickened the air until the visible world looked dreamlike. Participants often described feeling both heavy and transparent, body dissolving into rhythm, breath into silence. That was the moment the pipe completed its purpose. It turned the mundane into mist. The same smoke that blurred the edges of vision also blurred the edges of separation. Everyone in the circle, chief, elder, stranger, breathed the same prayer. For a few suspended minutes, hierarchy lost meaning. The pipe democratized divinity. To outside observers, it was just smoke. To those inside the circle, it was what connected them to everything that still moved unseen. And ancestors, winds, the long patience of the earth. When the bowl finally cooled and the stem was detached, the cosmos closed politely, as if saying, "We'll talk again soon." But not every conversation with the unseen needed stone or ceremony. Some used a humbler tool, one that didn't invite the spirits to speak, but politely asked them to leave. Sage was the opposite of tobacco, where one called spirits closer, the other asked them to take a step back, preferably toward the exit. Its smoke didn't carry prayers so much as it cleared the line, burned through static, and reset the air like a cosmic refresh button. The scent meant safety, familiarity, something old and quiet sweeping through the room. People burned sage not to summon anything, but to remind whatever was already there that it had overstayed its welcome. Among indigenous peoples across North America, the Lakota, Dine, Anishinabeb, and many other sage belonged to a family of sacred plants known as the smudges, along with sweetgrass, cedar, and tobacco. Each had a different task. Tobacco spoke, sweetgrass invited, cedar protected, but sage cleansed. Its job was to strip away residue of anger, grief, fear, or unwanted company until the world smelled clean again. To smudge a space meant to make it breathable, not just for lungs, but for the spirit. Ceremonially, it began with fire, always small and respectful. The dried bundle, bound with twine, was lit until it glowed but didn't burn. The smoke wasn't supposed to blaze, it was supposed to wander. A feather or hand coaxed it across faces, doorways, tools, or the corners of homes. You didn't just wave it aimlessly. You guided it, directing it into hidden spaces the way light finds dust. The motion was deliberate, as though drawing invisible geometry in the air. When the smoke brushed across skin, it didn't bless, it balanced. The anthropologists, when they arrived, gave it Latin names and chemical explanations. They wrote about volatile oils and antimicrobial properties, as if the point had been sanitation. In a way, they weren't wrong. Science eventually confirmed that burning sage really does kill bacteria and calm the nervous system. But to the people who used it first, it wasn't about molecules, it was about memory. Sage was the earth's breath, the scent of open plains and clean wind. When burned indoors, it brought the outside back in. Some elders said sage carried old sunlight in its leaves. Others said it remembered stories from before humans forgot how to listen. Its smoke had a texture soft but sharp, lingering in hair and clothing, like a reminder that everything in the world once smelled alive. People burned it after funerals, after arguments, before prayer, before sleep. Not to erase what happened, but to make room for what could happen next. Colonial authorities, of course, had no patience for that kind of spiritual housekeeping. To them, smudging was witchcraft, a superstition to be outlawed or politely replaced with incense. Churches banned it, schools mocked it, and missionaries called it pagan fumigation. Yet the practice survived in whispers behind closed doors, under blankets, in the woods after dark. When a new generation revived it publicly, centuries later, they didn't call it rebellion. They called it remembering how to breathe properly. Sage was never just about cleaning rooms, it was about cleaning time. The smoke drifted through generations, erasing fear, rewriting air, undoing the damage of forgetting. It was a conversation between breath and memory, one that didn't need translation. And while sage handled the surface, the visible hauntings of daily life, another plant waited deeper in the desert, one that didn't clear the air but shattered it wide open. Every place has a smell, and the body remembers it long after the mind forgets. The high desert carries the dry sweetness of sage and dust. The forests smell like wet bark and patience. For early people, those scents weren't aesthetic, they were coordinates. To breathe a place was to know where you belonged in it. Smoke became a portable version of home, the fragrance of a specific landscape bottled in ash and carried into ceremony. Modern science, with its microscopes and Latin, calls it volatile oils, eucalyptol, camphor, borneol molecules that explain why burning certain herbs clears bacteria and slows the heartbeat. The old healers already knew that, though not in the language of chemistry. They called it medicine air. Burn sage or cedar, they said, and the breath changes shape. The chest loosens, dreams calm down. It wasn't pharmacology. It was physics of the spirit, the understanding that air, when treated with respect, can rearrange what's wrong inside you. For the plains peoples, the smell of sage wasn't decoration, it was location. Each plant carried the DNA of its soil, the altitude of its home, the exact rhythm of the wind that had hardened its leaves. To inhale that smoke was to borrow a little of the land's endurance. People carried sage bundles into migrations, wars, and winters, lighting them to remind themselves that the world still had an outside. A scent followed them like a low hum, proof that the land was still breathing, even when distance said otherwise. Anthropologists sometimes described it as olfactory mapping, which sounds clinical enough to drain the life out of it. But the old ceremonies made scent into memory's anchor. Children grew up knowing the difference between burning sage and burning cedar without ever being taught. The nose was the first historian, its archive invisible but intact. Some healers even burned sage in their dreams, or so they said. In those visions, the smoke drifted across sleeping minds, clearing pathways for messages from ancestors who didn't always respect visiting hours. It was less mysticism than maintenance. The living and the dead shared the same air, and every now and then, it needed dusting. That's the secret modern spirituality often misses. The scent wasn't about purity, it was about continuity. When you burned a plant, you didn't destroy it, you gave it permission to travel. The smoke wasn't an ending, but an escape route. What rose from the fire wasn't loss, it was translation. Matter turning into memory, returning to the open sky that once fed it. And yet, there were other ways to travel between worlds, methods that didn't involve air or scent at all, but the inner geography of the mind. Not through smoke this time, but through ingestion, through a cactus that didn't burn, didn't perfume, but bloomed inside the body like a small green doorway. Out in the deserts of northern Mexico and the American Southwest grows a cactus that looks too small to hold a secret. No spines, no grandeur, just a soft green button pressed into the sand. But for thousands of years, people have walked days to find it, carried songs instead of maps, and sat through nights of cold wind to eat it raw. Peyote doesn't seduce with beauty, it tests with bitterness. And once it enters the blood, it rearranges reality quietly, thoroughly, as if the universe had just turned its face toward you and whispered, "Look closer." For the Hickel, the Comanche, the Kiowa, and later the Navajo, peyote was never a drug. It was grandfather, the cactus spirit that spoke in visions and corrected human arrogance. He didn't take it to escape, he took it to listen. Each small button, sliced from the earth with prayers, was treated like a teacher. People thanked the cactus before cutting it, leaving an offering: cornmeal, hair, a drop of blood. The harvest was selective, never greed, always dialogue. To gather without permission was to risk sickness, not from the plant, but from imbalance. The ceremonies themselves were intricate architectures of discipline. Picture a circular tipi, fire burning in the center, a half-moon altar of earth pressed against the front. Men and women sat facing inward, singing low songs that pulsed like heartbeat on horizon. The peyote buttons were chewed slowly, swallowed with water, and followed by hours of drumming so steady it seemed to teach time how to walk straight. Visions came not as hallucinations but as recognitions, threads between everything alive. Anthropologists, ever helpful, wrote of hallucinogenic sacraments and entheogenic rituals, as though language could disguise awe. What they missed was the structure. This wasn't chaos, it was order sharpened by hunger and heat. The fire symbolized life, the drum mirrored the heart, and the cactus became the voice that rose between them. Peyote didn't show random colors or imaginary beasts. It showed connection. People saw sound, heard color, felt the landscape breathing through them. If you believed you were separate from the world before the ceremony, you wouldn't afterward. The first few hours were usually nausea, the body's way of surrendering control. Then came the stillness, deep, vast, luminous. The air shifted texture. The songs seemed to hum from inside the skull, rather than outside it. Many described seeing ancestors, animals, the sun as a person, the earth as a mouth. Some said they died and came back. Others said they met nothing at all but silence, so large it forgave them. When dawn broke, the fire was extinguished, and the ashes were buried. The ceremony ended as softly as it began. Gratitude, exhaustion, a world slightly reassembled. The Catholic missionaries called it devil work. Colonial governments banned it. Soldiers destroyed caches of peyote. Missionaries preached about demons hiding in cacti. And yet somehow the ceremonies continued. They hid underground, merged with hymns, borrowed the language of saints to protect the language of stars. By the time the Native American church emerged in the late 19th century, peyote had become both medicine and resistance, a plant that refused to die because the land itself refused to forget. Its taste was still bitter, though the kind that lingers in the mouth and behind the eyes, reminding anyone who's ever swallowed it that enlightenment, like everything sacred, asks for discomfort first. But those visions didn't come cheaply. They demanded control, rhythm, repetition, a kind of spiritual architecture where ecstasy and discipline shared the same roof. Two outsiders. The peyote ceremony looked like chaos, singing, sweating, hallucinating in a smoke-filled tent while chewing bitter cactus buttons under a black desert sky. But anyone who's ever sat through one knows it's closer to military precision. There's rhythm, hierarchy, and choreography so exact it could make a Swiss clock jealous. Ecstasy, here, is not indulgence. It's endurance. The goal isn't to escape the body, it's to survive inside it long enough for the divine to make sense. The ceremony begins at dusk and stretches until sunrise. Time measured not by hours but by songs. The fire burns at the center, shaped like a half moon, symbolizing the world as seen from above. The firekeeper, chosen for steadiness and silence, feeds it carefully, keeping the flames alive but never unruly. Round the perimeter, participants sit cross-legged, men, women, elders, children facing the light, chewing peyote in slow, grim defiance of their taste buds. Each bite tastes like dust soaked in electricity, but endurance is part of the teaching. You don't get visions for free. The drum starts low. Its rhythm mimics the heartbeat until, at some point, you can't tell which one you're hearing. The songs in chant and cyclical build a sonic architecture. They're not improvised. Every syllable, every repetition has lineage. The sound, the cactus, and the fire form a triangle where the human and spirit worlds meet briefly to discuss continuity. It's not a trip, it's a conference, and everyone's expected to stay awake for it. The experience itself varies. Some see light, others hear voices, a few vomit decorously into the sand and call it purification. The hallucinations, if they come, are less about spectacle than insight. A vision might be an ancestor, an animal, a color that means forgiveness. The cactus teaches in metaphors, and the participant's only job is to keep breathing and not mistake symbolism for ego. The goal isn't transcendence, it's alignment. To walk the peyote road is to remember the world is alive and slightly watching. The ceremony is led by a roadman, a sort of conductor of consciousness. He decides when to sing, when to rest, when to pray. His authority is moral, not tyrannical. He keeps the circle intact. If someone loses composure, the firekeeper tends to them with water, tobacco, smoke, or quiet patience. No one mocks the one who falters. They might be seeing too much too fast. It's considered impolite to interpret another's vision. The cactus speaks differently to every ear. The discipline of the night mirrors the discipline of life. Between songs, the roadman often says, "Stay in the road." The road isn't literal, it's a way of being upright in chaos. Its humility as navigation. Those who walk it long enough learn that the visions fade, but the balance remains. The morning light always arrives gently, the fire reduced to glowing coals. Participants step outside the tipi, squinting at the horizon, faces streaked with ash and gratitude. The air smells of cedar, sweat, and survival. Anthropologists wrote about altered states of consciousness, but the people inside the tipi simply called it keeping the world alive for another day. Yet, beyond those firelit circles, a different fire was burning, the colonial fear of what couldn't be categorized. What they saw as madness was, to its practitioners, memory. And when law and church collided with the spirit world, it was the smoke that was outlawed first. Colonial authorities always seemed most terrified of what they couldn't translate. Smoke, drumming, ecstatic, silence, none of it fit neatly into scripture or tax records, and so they called it witchcraft. The ceremonies that once held the world together were recast as crimes against it. Tobacco, sage, and peyote plants that had carried prayers for centuries suddenly found themselves on trial. The charges: superstition, intoxication, and being inconveniently sacred. Missionaries saw the smoke and assumed deceit. They saw trance and called it madness. The idea that people could access the divine without intermediaries, without church walls, wine, or a priest was unbearable. So began the long project of spiritual domestication. The old fires were doused, the pipes confiscated, the songs rewritten or buried. In the Southwest, peyote ceremonies were outlawed as narcotic rites. In Canada and the Northern Plains, smudging was banned under the same category as gambling and heathen dances. The law, as always, had a curious way of confusing holiness with disorder. Meanwhile, Tobacco, the one sacred plant the colonizers actually liked, was stripped of its meaning and industrialized. They took the prayer out, kept the smoke, and called it progress. Factories replaced lodges. Paper-wrapped tobacco replaced pipes carved by hand. The breath of the gods became an export commodity, neatly taxed, packaged, and eventually medicalized as a national health crisis. Few ironies burn longer than that one. The repression was total, but not absolute. In desert canyons, ceremonies moved underground, literally. Families met in secret, disguised gatherings as night suppers or Bible studies. Hymns were rewritten in 2 languages, one for the colonizer's God, one for the cactus spirit that refused to die. In the 19th century, peyote traveled north with displaced tribes Comanche, Kiowa, Apache each, adding new prayers, new rhythms, new resilience. Out of persecution emerged one of the most enduring spiritual resistances in North America, the Native American Church. The Church was a miracle of adaptation. It wore Christianity like camouflage, replacing saints with spirits, communion with cactus, psalms with drumbeats. The cross stood beside the fire. The Bible rested beside the peyote buttons. To the untrained eye, it was an odd syncretism. To those inside the tipi, it was genius proof that tradition could bend without breaking. Under the gaze of colonial law, it said, "Fine, we'll speak your language, but our God still sings in Hickel." Anthropologists of the era described the movement with the usual condescension, a fusion of primitive mysticism and Christian ritual. What they missed was the political brilliance. In fusing the two, indigenous leaders created legal shelter for a spiritual practice older than the empire itself. The ceremony survived, not because it hid but because it adapted. The cactus lived on, its visions now carrying both crosses and stars, hymns and drumbeats, defiance and prayer. Yet repression leaves residue. Whole generations were taught to fear their own ceremonies, to see their ancestral medicines as sins. And even today, people still debate the legality of ingesting God through a cactus while sipping legal wine on Sundays. Civilization, apparently, prefers its altered states supervised, but the old fires never went out. They just burned lower, waiting for air, and when the wind finally returned, so did the smoke. Revival doesn't always arrive as revolution. Sometimes it starts as a whisperer, lone elder lighting a small bundle of sage in defiance of silence, or a family digging a pipe from storage after 2 generations of forgetting. The 20th century, for all its wires and wars, quietly rekindled what centuries of suppression tried to bury. The smoke returned first, curling through kitchens and community halls, cautious at first, then bold. A plant doesn't hold grudges. It just waits for the right hands to hold fire again. By the early 1900s, peyote circles were spreading from Texas to Saskatchewan, weaving displaced tribes into a new spiritual network. The Native American Church became both prayer and protest religion with paperwork, salvation with drumbeat. Its founders, like Quanah Parker, didn't frame it as rebellion, they framed it as balance. The Church borrowed just enough Christianity to survive in court, just enough tradition to survive in spirit. It was a masterclass in cultural judo, turning the colonizers' tools into armor. The revival wasn't just about peyote, it was a full-spectrum return of breath. Pipes were unwrapped, smudge bowls uncovered, songs taught again in languages that once had to hide behind English hymns. Sage, cedar, and sweetgrass returned to doorways and ceremonies, often alongside rosaries or hymnals. Syncretism became strategy. When law forbade one god, you simply called it another. The smoke didn't care whose name you spoke, it carried all of them the same way. By mid-century, anthropology finally caught up, though still awkwardly. Researchers began publishing papers that sounded half apologetic. It appears these rituals contain sophisticated psychological and ecological frameworks. Translation: they worked. The plants that once connected people to land and spirit were now being studied for mental health, trauma recovery, neurochemistry. Peyote, psilocybin, ayahuasca. All the old teachers reappeared, now wearing lab coats. The irony was exquisite. After centuries of outlawing indigenous spirituality, Western science was suddenly calling it promising. But inside the lodges, the revival had nothing to do with validation. It was about continuity. Elders who'd been punished in boarding schools for speaking their languages now taught grandchildren to pray with the same syllables. Ceremonies once whispered were sung aloud again. Each puff of tobacco, each spiral of sage smoke, each bitter cactus button swallowed in darkness said the same thing: we're still here. The plants hadn't been forgotten. They'd just been waiting for their students to return. And so the revival grew not as nostalgia, but as resistance disguised as breathing. To light a pipe was to defy extinction. To smudge a house was to erase centuries of imposed guilt. To chew peyote was to reclaim an ancient syllabus on how to be human among other living things. Every inhalation was a quiet declaration of sovereignty. The smoke that once rose to heaven now rose through layers of history, cleaning the air of centuries of arrogance. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The plants, after all, had always known patience better than politics. They would keep teaching whoever remembered how to listen. And in that persistence, the burning, the breathing, the swallowing of bitter wisdom, humanity rediscovered what it had forgotten: that the spirit world wasn't somewhere distant, glowing, or abstract. It had always been right here, just waiting for the air to clear. In the end, all smoke tells the same story, that everything living is just borrowed breath. The plants exhale, we inhale, we exhale. The world listens. Tobacco, sage, and peyote, each of them built a language from that exchange, teaching that the spirit world wasn't up there or out there, but woven into the rhythm of respiration. You didn't have to ascend a mountain or die to reach it. You just had to breathe with intention. Across the centuries, that truth survived under different names: medicines, sacrament, superstition, even felony, but the principle never changed. The act of burning, of inhaling, of releasing, was the first theology humans ever invented. Long before temples or scripture, there was smoke rising from a fire and someone whispering gratitude into it. Every civilization that followed merely rephrased that same intuition, that to communicate with the unseen, one must first exhale what's hidden inside. The elders always said, the smoke knew where to go. It found sorrow, clung to it briefly, then carried it off. It found gratitude and made it visible. Every ritual of fire and breath, whether in a plains lodge or an Amazonian clearing, was an echo of that ancient exhalation. The ceremony didn't end when the smoke cleared, it continued in the lungs of those who breathed it in. In their dreams, in the softened way they spoke afterward. The spirit world, it turned out, had never been closed. It just required participation. Modern people still search for transcendence through other means: meditation apps, laboratory psychedelics, wellness retreats scented with imported sage. They call it mindfulness, biohacking, or therapy, as if new names could erase the lineage. But the principle remains prehistoric: transformation through breath, communion through elements. The difference is that the old rituals treated it as dialogue, not consumption. The plants weren't tools. They were kin. When tobacco first burned in a pipe, when sage first smoked through the ribs of a clay bowl, when peyote first bloomed inside someone's bloodstream, humanity was learning how to listen. The teachers had no voices, only fragrance and rhythm. They taught that the boundary between body and world is an illusion sustained by shallow breathing. Take air deep enough and you realize the self isn't a fortress, it's a doorway. Every ceremony was, at heart, a rehearsal for death: burning, releasing, becoming air. That's what made it sacred. The same act that sent prayers upward also trained the living to let go. The body was a temporary pipe, the breath a temporary flame, the smoke a temporary soul. All existence was smudged air, lingering briefly before fading into whatever comes next. And so the rituals continue in deserts, in forests, in basements where the windows stay cracked open just enough for the ancestors to find their way in. Tobacco still burns, sage still cleans, peyote still dreams. Every exhale still writes the same message into the air, that nothing truly disappears, it just changes form. The spirit world, it seems, was never a destination, it was always an atmosphere. And every time someone lights the sacred plants, the line between heaven and breath briefly dissolves, and the world remembers itself again, alive, fragrant, and quietly breathing. The first time a human watched something burn, it must have felt like witnessing a transformation too swift for understanding. Flesh, leaf, wood, it all surrendered to light, and in return, the air filled with a grey ghost that rose and vanished into nothing. Fire was both cruel and kind. It consumed, but it also revealed that nothing ever truly stayed still. Smoke was proof of that matter, refusing to die quietly. Long before gods, there was fascination. When early humans gathered around their first controlled fires, they weren't only warming their hands, they were staring into the oldest question: where does it go? The crackle of fat, the hiss of resin, the way a body animal, or otherwise turned from solid to scent. Smoke offered the illusion of direction in death. It went upward, it always went upward. And that simple vertical line between earth and sky became the first theology anyone ever believed in. Archaeologists have found traces of intentional burning beside Paleolithic burials, ashes mingled with bones, charred animal fat, likely poured as offering. The practice doesn't look accidental. Someone, tens of thousands of years ago, decided the dead shouldn't stay cold. They needed warmth, escort, maybe a little light, to find their way into whatever waited beyond. Fire became a guide, smoke a message, humanity's first postal system to eternity. The scent was part of it too. Burning flesh and herbs release a sweetness that's unsettling precisely because it's familiar. To ancient people, that fragrance meant transition, the smell of the boundary being crossed. It wasn't just the dead that burned, grief burned with them. The living inhaled what they lost, breathing in the proof that something invisible could still be shared. Every funeral was an act of inhaling memory, even when no one had invented the word. In caves and open plains alike, the pattern held. Charred remains of campfires appear beside the earliest symbolic burials, red ochre dusted on corpses, flowers scattered, embers cooling nearby. The dead were not abandoned. They were transformed, released as vapor into the same air everyone else was breathing. Smoke blurred the line between what had perished and what still lingered. It made death visible and survivable at once. Fire, for all its violence, taught continuity. People began to burn things for the dead: food resin, bits of fur, anything fragrant enough to rise as offering. The act suggested an unspoken assumption that whatever awaited beyond breath could smell. The concept of the soul began not as philosophy, but as observation. Breath and smoke behaved alike, both invisible, both fleeting, both proof that something essential escaped when the body fell still. And once that connection was noticed, it never left human thought. Breath became spirit. Smoke became the trail it left behind. Even now, millennia later, the image persists. Souls ascending like smoke, vanishing but not extinguished, fading into sky yet somehow continuing elsewhere. Humanity saw in every rising plume a rehearsal for its own departure. But the story didn't stop with the campfire. Once smoke became spirit, breath became sacred. Death and life stopped being opposites and became exhalations of the same flame, to sides of the same invisible wind. And somewhere in that realization, people began to think, if smoke carries the dead away, perhaps it can also call them back. Breath was the first thing the living noticed, and the last thing the dying lost. It left the body like a thief, invisible and uncatchable. For early humans, that made it divine by default. Fire simply confirmed the suspicion. When they saw smoke rise from a flame or from a funeral pyre, they saw the same thing that left a person's mouth in their final gasp. Movement without body, presence without weight. That's how the idea of the soul began, not as philosophy, but as physics misinterpreted beautifully. Across the earliest myths, life and air were synonyms. The Egyptians said the god Atum breathed the first humans into being. The Greeks imagined Psyche the soul as a breathy whisper escaping through parted lips. In Hebrew, ruach meant both wind and spirit. In Sanskrit, prana, the same word used for breath, wind, and life itself. The pattern was universal. If it moves unseen and animates everything, it must be sacred. Fire made that invisible visible. It gave the breath a body of smoke. In a way, humans discovered immortality by accident through observation of combustion. When a log burned, it didn't simply disappear. It became something lighter that still traveled, danced, and rejoined the air. So when a body exhaled its last breath, people assumed it followed the same physics. The soul was the final smoke, drifting skyward to join the invisible majority. The earliest funerary fires were less about destruction than conversion, matter turning into memory. Even in cultures that never practiced cremation, breath stayed at the heart of existence. In China, qi circulated through everything alive. a spiritual current carried by the lungs of the world. In Polynesia, the Hother sacred breath was exchanged during greetings, mouth to mouth, acknowledging the shared substance of life. To breathe together was to belong to the same spirit. To stop breathing was to return it. Death wasn't disappearance, it was repayment. Fire reinforced that exchange by dramatizing it. The flames consumed what was heavy, and the smoke carried what was light. That duality, body to ash, soul to vapor, became the template for resurrection myths everywhere. The Zoroastrians called fire the mouth of truth, through which purity ascended. The Greeks imagined smoke rising from sacrificial altars as direct communication with Olympus. The act of burning anything, from grain to bodies, was less about worship and more about sending mail to the beyond. But for all its poetry, the belief had a practical logic. The earliest humans needed proof that death wasn't a waste of animation. Fire gave them a process that looked like transformation rather than loss. You could see the soul leave. You could smell it. You could track it until it blended with clouds. It comforted the living with a story that had physical evidence, brief, aromatic, and impossible to disprove. In the flicker between breath and flame, humans invented metaphysics. They didn't know it, of course. They just needed an explanation that made grief tolerable. And fire, generous as ever, offered one. That everything leaves a trace, even if it's only the scent of what used to be. That idea would soon evolve into ritual, the management of that invisible traffic between body and sky. When the dead began to burn, the living didn't just mourn. They became messengers. Cremation began as an act of logic, disguised as mercy. If breath was life and smoke was spirit, then burning the body was the only way to help the soul find its way home. Burial kept things trapped underground. Fire set them free. The earliest pyres weren't macabre, they were elegant, deliberate pieces of spiritual engineering. Fire wasn't the destroyer, it was the translator. Flesh turned to smoke, and smoke carried the message upward. This one has finished being heavy. In the Vedic rituals of ancient India, the pyre was built like a map. Logs arranged by cosmic geometry, layers of ghee, herbs, and spices turning the scent of death into something the gods might recognize. The priest's chant wasn't for the living. It was an instruction manual for the departing soul. Go forth by this path, they'd sing, as the flames rose. The smoke spiraled skyward, carrying both fragrance and intention. Ashes below, a scent above. To this day, in Hindu cremations along the Ganges, the logic remains. Only through combustion does one's Atman or soul reunite with the universal breath. The Greeks, predictably, made it more theatrical. Homer's heroes burned with ceremony armor gleaming beside the pyre, the air full of lament and incense. Smoke rose not only as a spiritual ladder, but as a declaration of honor. To burn meant to ascend visibly, your memory drifting above the battlefield where you fell. In the Iliad, the fire of Patroclus is described as devouring the night itself. There was no quiet dying in that world. Even death required spectacle. But not all smoke was celebration. Among nomadic tribes across Eurasia, the act of burning the dead was partly fear management. The belief lingered that if bodies stayed intact, spirits might as well. Fire prevented haunting. It sealed the threshold, ensuring that what had gone up didn't come back down uninvited. Death, like politics, needed boundaries. Archaeologists studying Bronze Age burial mounds often find a dual structure. Ashes buried below and soot-stained stones above, as if the ritual deliberately left proof for both worlds. Smoke for the sky, residue for the earth. Even in prehistory, humans were hedging their bets. If the afterlife had customs officers, at least the paperwork was in order. And yet, for all its practical efficiency, cremation carried tenderness. The living didn't simply watch, they participated. They fed the flames, offered oils, whispered names into the crackling air. To them, the fire wasn't consuming, it was embracing. The dead weren't gone. They were ascending visibly, their essence curling through the dusk. When the pyre died, what remained wasn't a corpse but ash, something weightless, portable, almost manageable. Even now, cremation sites, Vedic ghats, Bolognese beaches, Japanese temples, retain that strange equilibrium between horror and holiness. The smoke still smells of release. The air still feels altered. Every spark reenacts the same ancient equation. Body plus fire equals message. The recipients remain unknown. And once the smoke had established itself as a messenger, people began to send more of it. Not just the dead, but gifts, food, prayers, all bound for the same invisible postal address. Once people accepted that smoke could carry a soul, they naturally assumed it could carry a letter. Fire became the original courier service between the living and the dead, and the exchange was constant. Food, incense, fat, flowers, anything fragrant enough to rise was fed to the flames and trusted to find its recipient. If cremation sent the dead upward, these smaller offerings were follow-up correspondence, reminders that the living were still thinking about them. The afterlife, it seemed, required maintenance. In ancient Egypt, smoke was part of the economy of eternity. Temples functioned like post offices for the deceased, where priests burned incense daily to sustain the ka, the vital essence of the dead. The smell wasn't for decoration, it was nourishment. The gods, like the ancestors, were said to eat scent. Frankincense, myrrh, and kifitha, resinous trio, were the most prized. Their perfume was wealth, their smoke proof of devotion. The living sent aroma upward in hopes it would be recognized as currency on the other side. The Romans followed suit, but more bureaucratically. During Parentalia, the festival of the dead, families brought cakes and wine to tombs, then poured a portion into the ground or tossed grain into flame. They weren't feeding dirt, they were feeding continuity. The smoke curling from each household altar connected city and cemetery in a single fragrant web. Even household hearths doubled as shrines, ensuring that ancestors were never entirely absent from dinner. Farther east, in China, incense became the backbone of ancestor veneration. Thin coils of sandalwood and agarwood spiraled upward in rhythmic precision. Each stick was a timeline. As long as it burned, the living and dead coexisted. When it finished, the connection dissolved temporarily. The act was simple but profound. Light the tip, watch it, smoke, breathe together. The air became a shared medium, a kind of spiritual Wi-Fi running on aroma and faith. In the Americas, the same logic took shape in different smoke. The Lakota burned sweetgrass. The Mayans burned copal resin. Each culture picked its own signature scent, a distinct spiritual dialect. The living exhaled gratitude. The dead inhaled recognition. Even those who believed in distant heavens still preferred to communicate through local air. The invisible was easier to reach when it smelled like home. Anthropologists later catalogued these practices with dry fascination, describing them as olfactory metaphors for continuity, which is an academic way of saying that no one likes to feel ghosted by their dead. Burning something fragrant was the universal reply to silence. Over centuries, the ritual became so embedded in daily life that people forgot how strange it was. Churches filled with incense, temples with resins, households with scented candles, all descendants of the same ancestral logic. If it rises, it connects. Even modern funerals, with their perfumed flowers and curling smoke from crematoria, keep repeating the same gesture. We still feed the air, just with better ventilation. But not all communication with the dead required temples or priests. Sometimes the conversation happened closer to home, at the very center of it. In fact, before religion had architecture, it had a fireplace. The hearth wasn't just where people cooked. It was where the living and the dead agreed to meet halfway. Every civilization that mastered the art of keeping a flame indoors somehow decided it also kept company with their ancestors. The idea was almost mathematical. If smoke carried messages upward, then the fire that made it must be the doorway those messages passed through. Every home had won its own glowing embassy between realms. In ancient Rome, this belief was perfectly literal. Each household had its lares and penates, the domestic spirits of family and pantry who lived inside the hearth. Offerings of wine, grain, or honey were poured into the fire daily, partly to ensure good fortune, partly so nobody's grandmother came back cranky. The smoke curling out of a Roman chimney wasn't just carbon, it was a handshake between generations. To neglect the hearth was to invite chaos. Even emperors kept a private fire at home, supervised by the women of the family, as if political power depended on maternal pyromancy. Far from the marble villas, the same idea smoldered in wooden huts across Europe and Asia. Among Slavic families, the hearth was watched by a household deity called the domovoy, smoky little patriarch, who blessed or cursed, depending on how tidy you kept his corner. In West Africa, ancestral ashes were mixed into the clay floors near kitchen fires, so every meal quite literally sat atop the dead. When the stew bubbled and steam rose, it wasn't just food cooking, it was kin returning. The symbolism made practical sense. Fire preserved life by cooking, warming, and protecting, but it also consumed, like death. It was both nurture and ending. To feed it meant acknowledging mortality without flinching. The hearth, more than any altar, taught that death wasn't exile but participation. Even the ashes, those quiet grey leftovers swept aside each morning, were treated with a kind of reverence. They were proof that transformation had occurred and could happen again. Some archaeologists suggest that early burial sites evolved directly from hearths. When a family member died, their body was interred near the home fire to keep them close, to ensure their spirit didn't wander. The flames acted as boundary and invitation, keeping the dead inside the social circle, but politely on the other side of the light. It wasn't superstition, it was domestic theology. As time passed, the hearth became the prototype for temples. Every sacred flame, from the Zoroastrian fire altars to the Olympic torch, was a scaled-up version of someone's kitchen. Even today, candles lit for the dead mimic that same intimate act. Fire in a small cup, breathing gently, smoke curling upward like a signature. Every flicker still feels faintly inhabited, as if the air around it knows who it's for. But the hearth wasn't the only gateway. If the household fire connected a family to its ancestors, there were others who dealt with the broader traffic, those professional negotiators between life and death. Smoke and silence, who walked through invisible doors for a living, across tundras, rainforests, and steppe. There have always been specialists in crossing boundaries, the ones who knew how to climb smoke without leaving the ground. Shamans, medicine people, spirit walkers, whatever their name. They were the first professionals of the invisible world. Their work began where the hearth's reach ended. Ordinary smoke carried prayers. Their smoke carried passengers. In Siberia, a shaman's fire was never just fuel. Birch bark, juniper, and animal fat were burned in precise combinations, the flames roaring loud enough to frighten whatever lingered near. When the shaman inhaled the smoke, it wasn't for intoxication, it was to travel. The drumbeat began, steady, circular, imitating hooves, or perhaps heartbeat. Each strike thickened the air, and the smoke took on form, twisting like rope between worlds. The shaman climbed it in trance, their body trembling in place while their soul wandered toward the sick, the lost, or the newly dead. Among the Ewenki and the Yakut, it was said that a good shaman could ride the smoke straight into the sky, entering through a hole only the spirits could see. Their body, meanwhile, remained by the fire, twitching gently while assistants whispered protection prayers. When they returned, if they returned, they exhaled long and slow, releasing the last of the other world from their lungs. That first breath back in the human realm was always heavy, like dragging fog through bone. In the Amazon, the same principle took on different foliage. Shamans there burned tree bark, vines, or tobacco in dense, swirling clouds, drawing it deep into the chest until vision blurred. Their smoke didn't rise, it enveloped. It turned the air into a membrane between realms, and within it, spirits could be seen, coaxed, or negotiated with. Healing often meant persuading a lost soul to return to its owner, and persuasion, like politics, worked best over shared smoke. Even the Inuit shamans of the Arctic, where fires were small and smoke reluctant, managed their own versions. Seal fat lamps flickered against igloo walls, while chants and rhythmic breathing turned frost into fog. The shaman exhaled intentionally, watching the steam from their mouth mingle with lamp smoke. That was the moment of crossing the breath, leaving, the world expanding, the body becoming temporary architecture for something older than weather. Anthropologists later described these journeys as symbolic psychodramas, which is what you call miracles when you have tenure. But every account, from Siberia to the Amazon, describes the same anatomy: fire, smoke, sound, breath, and return. The pattern never changes. Someone breathes deeply enough to remember that death is not a place, but a direction. The shaman's smoke wasn't only for the dead, it also purified the living, healed the ill, rebalanced the unsteady. But in many traditions, those categories blurred. Illness was often a form of spiritual misplacement, a piece of someone wandering where it shouldn't. To heal meant to retrieve. To die meant to continue wandering. And soon enough, entire cultures would turn smoke itself into the cure for that wandering, burning herbs and resins to chase away not bacteria, but memory. Across tundras, rainforests, and steppe, There have always been specialists in crossing boundaries, the ones who knew how to climb smoke without leaving the ground. Shamans, medicine people, spirit walkers, whatever their name, they were the first professionals of the invisible world. Their work began where the hearth's reach ended. Ordinary smoke carried prayers. Their smoke carried passengers. In Siberia, a shaman's fire was never just fuel. Birch bark, juniper, and animal fat were burned in precise combinations, the flames roaring loud enough to frighten whatever lingered near. When the shaman inhaled the smoke, it wasn't for intoxication, it was to travel. The drumbeat began, steady, circular, imitating hooves, or perhaps heartbeat. Each strike thickened the air, and the smoke took on form, twisting like rope between worlds. The shaman climbed it in trance, their body trembling in place while their soul wandered toward the sick, the lost, or the newly dead. Among the Ewenki and the Yakut, it was said that a good shaman could ride the smoke straight into the sky, entering through a hole only the spirits could see. Their body, meanwhile, remained by the fire, twitching gently while assistants whispered protection prayers. When they returned, if they returned, they exhaled long and slow, releasing the last of the other world from their lungs. That first breath back in the human realm was always heavy, like dragging fog through bone. In the Amazon, the same principle took on different foliage. Shamans there burned tree bark, vines, or tobacco in dense, swirling clouds, drawing it deep into the chest until vision blurred. Their smoke didn't rise, it enveloped. It turned the air into a membrane between realms, and within it, spirits could be seen, coaxed, or negotiated with. Healing often meant persuading a lost soul to return to its owner. And persuasion, like politics, worked best over shared smoke. Even the Inuit shamans of the Arctic, where fires were small and smoke reluctant, managed their own versions. Seal fat lamps flickered against igloo walls, while chants and rhythmic breathing turned frost into fog. The shaman exhaled intentionally, watching the steam from their mouth mingle with lamp smoke. That was the moment of crossing the breath, leaving, the world expanding, the body becoming temporary architecture for something older than weather. Anthropologists later described these journeys as symbolic psychodramas, which is what you call miracles when you have tenure. But every account, from Siberia to the Amazon, describes the same anatomy: fire, smoke, sound, breath, and return. The pattern never changes. Someone breathes deeply enough to remember that death is not a place, but a direction. The shaman's smoke wasn't only for the dead. It also purified the living, healed the ill, rebalanced the unsteady. But in many traditions, those categories blurred. Illness was often a form of spiritual misplacement, a piece of someone wandering where it shouldn't. To heal meant to retrieve. To die meant to continue wandering. And soon enough, entire cultures would turn smoke itself into the cure for that wandering, burning herbs and resins to chase away not bacteria, but memory. Before microscopes invented guilt, people believed sickness was a social problem, not a cellular one. A fever meant something or someone had crossed the wrong boundary. Illness was a visitation, an uninvited guest from the other side. And the cure, naturally, involved asking it to leave politely, through smoke. Long before antiseptics and vaccines, purification meant fumigation, and medicine was indistinguishable from exorcism. Every culture had its own recipe for clean air. In the Middle East, it was frankincense and myrrh. In North Africa, desert herbs and resin. In Europe, juniper branches burned in sick rooms until the patients couldn't tell whether they were healing or suffocating. In Asia, smoke was shaped into art. China's Xiangqi censers exhaled intricate streams of sandalwood through dragon mouths. Japan's monks walked through clouds of incense so thick that holiness probably had a half-life. And in the Americas, the smudging of sage and cedar was a spiritual deep clean, part sanitation, part diplomacy with the unseen. The logic was elegant. If breath was life, and disease tampered with breath, then you fixed the air first. The ancients understood something modern people forgot. The line between plague and haunting is mostly semantics. When epidemics swept through towns, entire streets burned herbs in windows, hoping to smoke out both demons and contagion. Medieval doctors in plague masks stuffed their beaks with cloves, mint, and lavender, believing the fragrance itself formed a shield. Science would later call it antimicrobial. They just called it survival. Egyptians disinfected temples after burials with resin smoke so pungent that even the gods must have coughed. The Romans, admirably pragmatic, used sulfur fumes to chase away ghosts. In truth, sulfur dioxide does kill bacteria, but it also peels paint and lungs. The line between chemistry and ritual was always a bit smoky. Among indigenous peoples of North America, smoke cleansing wasn't limited to the sick. It was routine maintenance for the soul. After funerals, warriors returning from battle were smoked off with sage or cedar to strip away the residue of death. You didn't want otherworldly things clinging to your aura like burrs. Even newborns were brushed with smoke to ensure they entered the world unhaunted. It was hygiene with better storytelling. Anthropologists later noticed that every culture which burned plants for ritual purity happened, coincidentally, to choose herbs with actual antiseptic properties. Sage, cedar, myrrh, frankincense, all now verified by laboratories to kill airborne pathogens. It seems faith got there first. Science simply confirmed the footnotes. Yet purification was never just about health. It was about restoring order, rebalancing the breath that illness disrupted. To cure someone wasn't only to remove disease, it was to convince their spirit to stay inside their body. Smoke bridged that negotiation. It spoke both languages, the material and the metaphysical. And when the smoke cleared, when the air finally smelled less like fever and more like forgiveness, one thing remained consistent. The living always burned something to fix what they couldn't explain. The sick, the grieving, the afraid, they all reached for flame and fragrance, because what rises cannot fester. But some smoke wasn't for cleansing. It wasn't for healing or summoning or sterilizing. It was for letting go on last offering to ensure the dead didn't linger too long in borrowed breath. Grief, when it had no words, learned to burn. Across continents, the morning fire became the one place where sorrow was allowed to move, to rise, vanish, and be momentarily beautiful. Every wisp of smoke was a translation of the unbearable into something breathable. When people couldn't cry, they burned. And when they couldn't stop crying, they burned more. In ancient China, the living sent their grief up in the form of geese and paper money, folded and fed to flames so the dead could spend comfortably in the afterlife. The smoke carried currency to the other side, inflation-proof and elegantly metaphorical. Love as financial transaction, sorrow as economy. The more you burned, the richer your ancestors' eternity. Temples turned into smoky banks, where grief was both ritual and accounting. Among the Aztecs, smoke was language itself. The dead didn't just receive offerings, they inhaled messages. Copal resin burned beside graves, its milky scent said to attract the souls of the departed back for conversation. During festivals of the dead, precursors to the Dia de los Muertos, the air was so thick with smoke and perfume that the boundary between world and underworld felt porous. The living wore the same scent as the dead, so no one could tell who was visiting whom. Even in medieval Europe, morning smelled like frankincense and candle wax. Churches were clouded with it, not just for sanctity but for mercy. The perfume masked both decomposition and despair. The Latin word incensum meant something set on fire, but it also implied emotion. The burning of incense and the burning of hearts were never far apart. Every requiem mass was half chemistry experiment, half seance. In many African traditions, smoke carried grief outward through song. Mourners circled the fire, wailing as the air thickened. The smoke didn't just rise, it wrapped around them, absorbing their cries, softening the rawness. To breathe it in was to share in the pain, to metabolize loss communally. No one suffered alone when the air itself was grieving. Among indigenous nations in North America, funerary smoke was sometimes seen as a kind of escort. Cedar or sage fires were lit to guide the spirit home, the scent marking a safe passage. The living avoided putting out such flames too soon. It was considered rude to cut short someone's final journey. The smoke had work to do. Anthropologists studying these rituals often describe them clinically, olfactory expressions of bereavement, but there's something visceral about it that transcends vocabulary. Smoke makes grief visible for a moment, lets it move, dissipate, reform, and rise again. Watching it fade gives the heart something to imitate. Even more than crematoria, sterile and mechanical, still follow the same ancient choreography. The body burns, the smoke rises, the family stands below, pretending not to look up. And when they leave, someone inevitably lights a candle at home, a small, private echo of the same gesture humans have made for tens of thousands of years. Go on, it's all right to leave. But smoke, as always, wasn't only an ending. For some, It became the proof that endings were illusions, that if breath could cross the line between worlds, maybe the dead hadn't gone anywhere at all. Somewhere along the long, smoky trail of human thought, people began to notice a strange symmetry. Every breath goes out, but another always comes in. Fire, too, devours what it touches, yet never really dies, it simply changes shape. That rhythm between inhaling and exhaling, burning and rising, dying and returning, it was impossible to ignore. Sooner or later, someone decided the smoke didn't just leave, it came back. The Egyptians were obsessed with this idea. The smoke of incense rising in temples wasn't a one-way prayer, it was a breath exchange. Each plume that vanished into the rafters was believed to return, purified, as the god's own exhalation. To inhale temple air was to borrow a little divinity. Incense wasn't decoration. It was respiration shared with eternity. Even mummification, the ultimate preservation of breath, ended with fumigation. The lungs of the dead were gone, but the air was still moving for them. In the Zoroastrian fire temples of ancient Persia, priests tended flames that had burned for centuries. The smoke curling through the vents was considered proof that the sacred fire was still alive, still breathing for the community. To extinguish it was unthinkable, equivalent to cosmic suffocation. The flame's smoke became a surrogate for immortality. As long as it kept rising, the divine order held. The ritual didn't promise salvation. It enacted respiration on a planetary scale. In Vedic India, the same principle turned into mathematics. Each fire altar was constructed to mirror the cosmos, and its smoke to reenact creation. The pyre of the deceased mirrored the sacrificial fire of the gods. When the flames consumed the body, the soul joined the cosmic breath, destined to return through wind, rain, crops, and eventually another body. Reincarnation, at its root, is smoke theory refined. What burns today feeds tomorrow. The same logic surfaced independently everywhere. In ancient China, Taoist rituals burned scrolls covered in written prayers. The characters, once legible, were released as curls of smoke. The words ascended, dissolved, and if fate was kind, rained back down as answered fortune. The act was less superstition than symmetry. What rises must return. Smoke was simply how the universe exhaled. Among the Pueblo and Navajo peoples, smoke from sacred tobacco wasn't an offering but a conversation. To blow smoke was to breathe life back into the world, an act of balance between mortality and motion. When elders exhaled smoke during blessings, they weren't just sending it away, they were returning it to the cycle. The world, after all, was alive only as long as something kept breathing. Even in Christianity, where resurrection was codified into creed, the imagery never left. Candles burned for saints, incense rose during masses, and every Easter vigil began in darkness, broken by flame, the divine lung inhaling light again. The resurrection of Christ was told in words, but enacted in smoke. The tomb was empty, yes, but the air was full. And so the idea matured, that nothing really dies, just changes state. Smoke, like memory, may disappear from sight, but it's always in the air somewhere, moving invisibly, occasionally catching the light. The boundary between breath and soul blurred until they became synonyms again, just as they were at the beginning. But the final and perhaps most haunting transformation of smoke wasn't about gods or ancestors, it was about the people left behind, those who learned to live with both air and absence, breathing what the dead had left suspended. There's an old superstition still whispered in villages and half-remembered prayers, that every breath you take carries the last sigh of someone who came before. It isn't romanticism, it's physics. Air circulates, smoke never really leaves. The atoms of every cremation, every incense stick, every campfire, confession, drift endlessly through the same shared lungs. The living, whether they mean to or not, are always inhaling their dead. In many indigenous traditions, that truth was neither frightening nor poetic, it was daily reality. Among the Ojibwe, the burning of sage wasn't just to cleanse a space, but to invite the presence of those who'd gone before, gently, like asking them to step out of the walls and sit by the fire. In the Andes, families left coals burning overnight after funerals so the souls could visit and warm their feet. The next morning, the air felt different, thicker, still carrying the breath of conversation that crossed the threshold while no one was watching. Every culture built its architecture around this invisible company. Chimneys, censers, funeral pyres, all designed not merely for ventilation but communication. In Japan's Obon festival, Lantern smoke leads spirits home. In Madagascar, families reopen tombs and burn herbs to refresh their ancestors' air. Cities filled with incense haze, cathedrals fogged by sanctified smoke-its, civilization's quiet admission that we still live in a world half inhabited by those we've burned. Modern people, with their filters and air purifiers, try to forget this intimacy. We sterilize grief, seal ashes in boxes, and call the process closure, as if the air obeys such language. Yet even crematoria have chimneys, and the smoke goes somewhere. Scientists estimate that the atmosphere still contains particles from Roman funeral pyres, medieval incense, and the torches of forgotten rituals. To breathe on this planet is to participate in a slow, continuous memorial. Every lungful is a reunion, and maybe that's why smoke still feels holy, even when it's just from a candle or a cigarette. There's an ancient reflex in the human body that recognizes rising vapor as presence. We stare at it, follow its motion, imagine it carrying meaning. It comforts us to think that nothing ever truly disappears, only changes altitude. In the end, smoke is the perfect theology, visible for a moment, gone in an instant, yet always there, diffused through everything. It connects pyres to incense burners, shamans to kitchens, mourning to celebration. It is grief and divinity, infection and cure, message and memory all sharing the same upward motion. And as it fades, it leaves behind what humans have always been afraid to name aloud, that life itself is combustion, and every breath we take is a small act of resurrection. Because long after the fires go out, the smoke stays. It drifts, invisible, through the ribs of the living, proof that the dead never stopped breathing.